Hi, my name is Rohit Day, and I'm an associate professor of history at Yale University. I'm very grateful to Dr. Guya Rashad and Dr. Lee for inviting me to join the workshop. In my paper today, I hope to address two conceptual and methodological questions that frame the challenges of writing new international histories of South Asia. Firstly, how do we write about a transformation that is international in ideas and practice across North America, Europe, Africa, and Asia, but yet is deeply rooted in the experience of South Asian communities? Secondly, how do we write a history that takes decolonization as a process that continues well beyond the event of political independence itself? I want to chart this really by looking at the emergence of the practice of minority rights in the 20th century. Over the course of the century, legal instruments across the globe have increasingly articulated and recognized minority rights. These range from the emergence of the minority as a political category in the late 19th century, through international covenants and treaties in the interwar period, to the institution of national constitutional protections and the emergence of framework of multicultural rights in the West in the late 20th century. There's a considerable body of work on the subject, but they sort of fall into two categories. The first that really focuses on how thinkers, politicians, philosophers have articulated claims around the questions of minority rights, really a sort of history of ideas or concept history. The second traces the origins of various legal instruments, looking at negotiations between states, diplomats, constitution drafters, and politicians. Significant as this work has been, they have primarily focused on the creation of norms rather than their articulation and assertion through everyday interactions and the embeddedness of these norms in certain kinds of social structures. So what this paper hopes to do is to move away from the sort of vaulted negotiating chambers of the UN and the Gothic university campuses of Europe and North America to follow the careers of four Indian African lawyers who worked with communities across the globe to secure a range of claims from minorities' access to schooling, to protect them from police torture, and to claim their rights to freedom of speech and expression. What I want to do in this paper is to use these lawyers and their experiences as tracers to understand the connections that fashion the post-World War II discourse on minority rights. Focusing on lawyers as opposed to law, decenters the physical side of lawmaking and draws attention to how rights norms are flowed across circulation and flows. So in short, I want to argue that the travels of Indian African lawyers and the politics and techniques they carried shaped the conceptual and strategic world of minority rights in the mid-20th century. Indian migrants moving through the British imperial networks in the interwar period have often been framed as sinews of empire themselves, building the British Empire through their labor and their capital. Overseas Indians begin making claims of minority rights as imperial subjects, as an imperial minority. But as their status changes with the emergence of post-colonial states, and their status becomes transformed as national minorities in an ethno-majoritarian state, their forms of claim-making change. What I want to show is that the voyages of these Indian diasporic lawyers reveals how sinews of empire turns first into a network of decolonization and then becomes a network that incubates a range of claims, reordering the ideas and strategies of minority rights in the post-war period. This brings up to a particular challenge of studying lawyers themselves. Much of the historiography of lawyers seeks the legal profession as a national category. So when we study the legal profession as a whole, it's really trying to understand how one particular jurisdiction evolves certain kinds of norms and practices. There is, of course, another body of work that focuses on individual lawyers, really as exceptional figures. Here we think of lawyers in the civil rights movement or the anti-apartheid struggle, but this very often does not locate them within a larger embedded context, and also continues to work within a national framework. I draw upon new scholarship that looks at the role that lawyers play as cultural mediators between state and society. And this becomes particularly interesting in the case of Indian African lawyers, where the Indian lawyers act as mediators between very often a European settler state and a largely indigenous African population. It also leads us to the question of how do we read the writing and practices of lawyers as a set of authentic or coherent ideas, given that many of these speech acts and these tactics are enacted as a way of securing claims for whichever group they're seeking to represent at the time. So what they say or do might be what is most effective, but might not necessarily represent a coherent set of beliefs. So I'm going to move across four cities in the 1970s to draw out four different genres of lawyering that this paper looks at. The first story begins in Birmingham in the United Kingdom in 1976. Gurinder Singh Mangla, pictured here on my right, is a 12-year-old schoolboy who has achieved admission into an elite public school. The headmaster refuses Gurinder admission as long as he continues to wear his hair long in a turban as required by his Sikh faith. Gurinder's father, Seva Singh Mandla, was one of the first non-white solicitors in Birmingham, decided to file a complaint of racial discrimination in the UK's newly formed Commission of Racial Equality. The commission had been established a year earlier under the Race Relations Act in response to activism by migrants from Commonwealth countries who faced racial discriminations in jobs, housing, and public places. Mandla is successful before the commission, but the decision is overturned in the Court of Appeals, led by Lord Denning, the so-called liberal hero, who emphasized that the act expressly did not protect religion, politics, or culture. He told the petitioners, "You must remember that it's perfectly lawful to discriminate against groups to which you take an objection, as long as they're not a racial group. You can discriminate against Moonies or skinheads or any other group that you dislike or to which you take objection." The only protection afforded by the Commission of Racial Equality concerned discrimination on the grounds of a man's color, or his race, or of his nationality, or national or ethnic origins. The court also pointed out that the headmaster had admitted a number of Asian students who conformed to the uniform regulations, including six students. This formalistic interpretation of the law was demeaning to Sikhs, but also reversed gains that had been won by decades of activist organizing. So in the 1960s and 70s, Sikh organizations in Wolverhampton, Manchester, and Birmingham, where the Mandlas lived, had successfully lobbied local councils to permit Sikh public transport workers to wear the turban instead of a regulation cap. These campaigns involved producing pamphlets to educate the British public and officials on Sikh religion, on the contributions of Sikhs to the British war effort, and the accommodation granted to Sikhs across the British Empire. The judgment denying a racial discrimination claim on the grounds that Sikhs were not a nation or race, unlike, say, Indians or Pakistanis, coincided with campaigns in India for a separate Sikh province or a largely autonomous Sikh state. The ruling therefore roused Sikh public opinion in both Britain and India, and after discussions with Mangla, Sikh religious and community leaders in Britain mounted a massive international campaign for the right to wear a turban. At the peak of the movement, 75,000 Sikhs marched through Hyde Park, prompting the government to promise to amend the law if the judgment is not reversed on appeal. In part because of the historical ethnographic evidence produced by Mandla and his lawyers, the House of Lords ultimately reversed Lord Denning's decision, holding that Sikhs are more than a religious sect, they're almost a race and almost a nation. And the Mandla decision since then has been canonical in both British and EU law for the purposes of defining the ethnic community and for recognizing exemptions of cultural practice, such as the wearing of a headscarf by Muslim women. Our second story opens in Delhi, and the lawyer here is Pushpa Kapila Hingorani of the Indian Supreme Court, who, while reading the newspaper one morning, becomes aware of the miserable conditions of pretrial prisoners in the state of Bihar, many of whom had already spent a longer time in prison awaiting trial than they would have faced if convicted and given the maximum sentence. Deeply troubled by the prisoner's apparent helplessness, Hingorani files a writ of habeas corpus before the Supreme Court of India. The judges, while sympathetic, are skeptical of the motion. Traditionally, to appeal under the Indian Constitution, the petitions had to prove their rights had been infringed, and the petitions in this case had not actually approached the court, nor had they deputized Hingorani as their representative. Mrs. Hingorani pointed out that most of the pretrial detainees were in the predicament precisely because they lacked legal knowledge and had been unable to secure legal representation. Given the circumstances, she convinced the courts that they could use their inherent powers under Article 42 to render complete justice and fashion new remedies. Hingorani's petition in the Hussain Ara Khatun case marks the emergence of legal strategies that would undergird India's PIL revolution, where the courts would permit public-minded individuals to represent groups and interests who could not represent themselves before the court. And produce a range of innovations from relaxing the requirements of standing, permitting new ways of bringing in information before the court, from newspaper reports to postcards, setting up mechanisms of independent fact-finding and devising new forms of relief. Over the next 2 years, Mrs. Hingorani would be appointed an independent commissioner to investigate those imprisoned. She could summon bureaucrats and talk to jail officials. And this led to the freeing of all those pretrial detainees who'd already served longer sentences than they would have if they were found guilty. About 40,000 prisoners were released by the Supreme Court, ruling that to hold them further was a violation of their rights to life and liberty under the Constitution. The court also directed the state to provide free legal aid for the poor as an essential requirement for any fair and just procedure. And while the PL revolution continues through the 80s and 90s, and many lawyers and judges participate in it, Hingorani's role is serendipitous and important. And through the 1980s, she continues to bring PIL cases that seek to improve conditions in women's shelters, liberate bonded labor, and bring justice to victims of police torture. Our third site is Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, in the University College's Law School, where Professor Yashpal Ghai, pictured here, delivered a lecture in 1970 on the title Constitutions and Political Order in East Africa. Ghai had been teaching in the law faculty at the University of Dar es Salaam, the first law school in East Africa since 1963. During his time in campus, the school had been a site of many radical politics. It had been a gathering space for African and expatriate scholars who were developing critical interdisciplinary legal studies. Ghai's lecture itself followed years of campus protests, state closures, and expulsions of radical students. And in his lecture, he noted that it's surprising that even the radical students of the law faculty have shown little interest in constitutions or constitutional developments in the region. He argued that this disinterest comes from the fact that the constitutional norms were seen as alien to African societies, or that these constitutions have been imposed on African states through the process of independence and peacekeeping. Ghai urged the students to consider the radical possibilities inherent in constitutional law, including its potential as a weapon of political struggle. He noted that with the constitution replacing the ever-brooding authority of the colonial state, minorities had particularly become aware of the vulnerability and had begun to agitate for special constitutional safeguards and power-sharing mechanisms. He noted that post-independence, many of the independence constitutions were being overturned, and he reviewed developments in Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. He cautioned the audience that the role that constitutions play in legitimating a regime, and it's precisely the power of legitimacy that makes constitutional study and struggle important. Ghai's words were prophetic for his own career, and over the next several decades, he'd be a key advisor in constitution making and reform projects in Papua New Guinea, Seychelles, Vanuatu, Kiribati, Fiji, Solomon Islands, Hong Kong, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, finally chairing the Kenyan Constitutional Reform Committee in the early 2000s. And the last episode I look at is in 1972 in the city of Victoria in Seychelles, which at this point of time was gripped with political excitement as strikes and clashes between the police and trade unions dominated the island. A key figure here was Frans Albert Rene, the nationalist president of the Seychelles People's United Party, whose speeches and writings emphasized the right of oppressed people to take up violence to fight their oppression. I won't get into the details here, but Rene is brought to court in a case involving a bombing that takes place by a political actor who's a member of Rene's union. Rene hires a Kenyan lawyer, Achuram Kapila, a leading defense lawyer, to represent him. And the trial becomes a trial really of Rene's political beliefs, where the Attorney General grills him about a speech he delivers to the crowd in Victoria a few hours before the bombings. And rather than establishing or challenging the guilt of the accused, Ashtu Kapila, his intervention really focuses on asking Rene to distinguish between war and political war, giving an opportunity to explain what he means by lawful struggle. While the bomber is found guilty, Rene himself emerges unscathed and goes on to be the Prime Minister of the Seychelles a few years later. Kapila himself is no stranger to this form of trial, and from the 1950s had been defending significant political leaders in East Africa, Jomo Kenyatta, Odinga, coup plotters in Somalia, nationalist politicians in Tanzania, the political opposition in Uganda. However, Rene's decision to call upon Kapila was also seen as significant, given that Kapila was of Indian descent and Rene had been accused of promoting enmity against the Seychelles Indian community. And in their papers, Kapila talks about how this case forged a warm relationship between him and Rene. And as he parted Victoria, Rene gave Kapila a copy of Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. So we see now 4 very different cases that seem to have little to do with each other. The first involves a claim of discrimination against a private authority using an existing law by a member of an affected party, that is Mandla's case. In Hingorani's case, we see a constitutional innovation to protect a group that is unable to represent itself. The third really looks at the role of constitutions in mediating differences between separate groups in a post-colony, and this is Ghai's lecture and body of work. And the last is a politically charged but a fairly quotidian case of criminal defense. This is Kapila's defense of Rene in the Seychelles. What I want to argue is that the number of features that are in common with this. The first striking commonality, of course, is the identity of the four lawyers, all of whom had been brought up in Nairobi in families of Indian Punjabi migrants to Kenya. And they'd all gone on to train as lawyers, particularly barristers in the UK. They shared close personal connections. Ashru Kapila and Mrs. Hingorani were cousins. Kapila himself had represented Mandla in a criminal case in Kenya in the late 70s. The Ghai and Kapila families knew each other knew each other for several years. The second case, of course, is that all of these exemplify certain forms of minority claims making that drew on long-standing traditions that arose out of India or the experience of the Indian diaspora. For example, Mandla's claim to preserve a marker of group identity is done in the language of equal citizenship. And this is a long genealogy, perhaps one of the earliest and best-known cases of asserting the right to wear a turban in public place was made by Mohandas Gandhi in South Africa. Lawyers in South Africa had been required to remove their hats before arguing in court, but Gandhi repeatedly asserted his right to wear a turban, preferring in many cases to leave the courtroom rather than remove his headgear. He argues that this is not only the idea of equality that is enjoyed by all British subjects, and Indians in South Africa are British subjects, but also in the special rights and privileges he enjoyed as a British subject in India, which traveled with him as he moved across the British Empire. Be it the right to wear a turban, the right to the recognized personal law, or the practice of parda, irrespective of where they move within British jurisdictions. And we'd see this continue in protests against compulsory identity cards and registration of Indian marriages, both of which were framed as violating the rights of Indian women, which they carried with them when they came to South Africa. Kapila Hingorani's maneuver, for example, to represent a group that cannot represent itself, also has long roots in the Indian national movement and its diaspora. Miti Mukherjee points out in her work, the earliest framework for nationalist claim-making in India involved Indian elites posing as loyally representatives for the Indian masses who could not represent themselves. As Indians migrated across the British Empire, both the Indian National Congress, through its affiliate bodies, and the government of India, through the High Commissioner, demanded that the rights of Indians in South Africa, Malaysia, Fiji, Kenya, etc., be protected in the absence of Indian representation in the territories. As Firoz Naroji, Achurram Kapila's junior in the Rene case has recently argued, the rights of Indians in Africa were closely tied to the status of Indians in India and India within the world system. The recognition of India as an equal member of the British Empire could only be achieved if Indians gained franchise and equal rights across other sides of empire. This act of intervention required required intervention from above, that is, the need to petition London rather than working through the structures of power within the colony itself. Very similarly, and almost in parallel, in the PIL system, lawyers advocating for public interest focused their efforts on Supreme Court in Delhi rather than against local administrations. And as critics of PIL have now begun to point out, the intervention produced relief only by recognizing and expanding somewhat untrammeled powers of the Supreme Court. And there's a sort of parallel drawn here between the kind of hegemony of British imperial authority and that of the Indian Supreme Court when you have these practices of petitioning. Yash Ghai represents a minority's faith in constitutional protection in post-colonial India. And early on, Ghai had noted both the colonial interests inherent in post-colonial constitutionalism, protecting, say, the right to property, but also the power of constitutions as a mechanism for minority protection. As a constitutional advisor in Tanzania in the 60s and 70s, he named constitutional autochthony, or popular participation or drawing on indigenous roots, as a necessary and key base for legitimating constitutions. He was keenly aware that the Indian constitution was one of the few successful examples of autochthonous constitution making and the codification of minority rights in the post-colonial world. As recent scholarship suggests, the popular roots of Indian constitutionalism lie in the active engagement of a range of minorities. And Ghai's own career as a post-colonial constitution maker In 2005, Yashkai reflected on his long career as a constitution designer, noting that all prevailing models of constitutions suffered from certain flaws. For example, liberal neutrality in constitutions in multi-ethnic societies often use the language of uniformity to paper over majoritarianism. Whereas consocial constitutions often ended up reifying group identities, making it difficult for a society to function, creating permanent axes of conflict. Guy therefore proposed a threefold solution that started by building constitutional models from within the country, that is, autochthonously. He secondly suggested that minority rights required a guaranteed set of power sharing mechanisms, ranging from representation in the executive, regional autonomy, proportional representation, civil service and public fund allocations, as well as minority vetoes on certain issues. But most significantly, he held that protection of minorities had to be time-bound to be for a period of transition in ethnically divided societies to allow for the establishment of a certain kind of liberal democratic order in the future. Finally, Achtu Kapila's work in the Seychelles and elsewhere seems to be the most mundane act of lawyering, requiring knowledge of courtcraft and quotidian criminal law and procedure. But that is precisely the point. The bulk of work of protecting minorities in the 20th century relied on ordinary law. And the law that existed in post-colonial states was often inherited from the colonial state and expanded and very often saw an expansion of powers as the post-colonial states sought to harness the law to meet its own particular ends. The work of minority lawyering was much more than just courtcraft. It also ranged from creating the public spectacle of political trials to lead to organizing, to engage in letter writing, prison visits, supporting families, and fundraising. Kapila is perhaps the best known of these lawyers in East Africa, but he's one of many Indian origin criminal lawyers who manned the barricades against both the colonial state and its successors across the British Empire. So the question at the heart of this paper is really to investigate how did this Indian African lawyer, the four figures we see, become such a figure in mid-20th century world history. And there are several elements that go into making the visibility of this figure. The first, of course, is the story of sheer numbers. In 1950, India had the second largest number of lawyers in the world, just after the United States. And while this is, in comparison to its population, low, it's significantly larger than the population of native-born lawyers in most post-colonial states. In fact, this is a long-standing tradition, and even in the 1930s, India had twice the number of students studying law than even the United Kingdom did. We see this, of course, as a result of early and cheaply available legal education in India, as well as the ability of members of the Indian diaspora overseas to access legal education in the UK or back in India. So again, by the 1940s and 50s, in East Africa, we see that Indian lawyers emerge as a significant part of the legal profession. So for instance, in 1968, of the 292 lawyers who joined the bar, 227 were Indian, and only 57 were European, and only 11 were native African. What allowed Indian lawyers to sort of practice across the empire was not just the command of law, but the command over specific laws. Many of these were utilitarian codes that had been written for India in the mid-19th century, but were really written as distillations of universal principles to be made applicable elsewhere. And as the empire expanded, these codes were made applicable all over the world, from Sudan to Palestine to Malaysia. However, while these laws were imperial in its inception, in practice, to interpret them, they relied greatly upon precedents and textbooks that were published for the Indian market. So if you walked into a lawyer's library in the 1950s and 60s, whether it's in Uganda or in Malaysia, you'll find a range of commentaries on laws from India or case reporters from India that form the bulk of legal practice. Or indeed, as Fahad Bashara's work recently shows, in many cases, such as in Zanzibar, the presence of Indian lawyers led to a demand to bring in the Indian legal codes and a kind of emerging culture of legal publishing that began to export in these periods. Therefore, in East Africa, which remained a racially segregated and divided society, the legal profession was one of the rare spaces which saw some degree of parity between Europeans and Asians. So, for example, the Law Society of Kenya by the 1940s had reached a practice where they would alternate between Indian African and a European lawyer to head the legal profession. In the 1940s, the role played by Indian independence also acted as a major factor in galvanizing the Indian African lawyer. This is particularly because the 40s saw an emergence of a powerful and vocal Kenyan nationalist movement. The presence of the Indian community in Kenya had a complicated relationship with the larger African populace. And the political leadership had deferred on whether to work with the Kenyan nationalists or to maintain a more neutral or collaborationist position. India's independence, and particularly its High Commissioner to Kenya, actively encouraged the Kenyan Indian leadership to work with African nationalists like Jomo Kenyatta. They saw that the role of the Indian diaspora was critical, not just for decolonizing these spaces, but also for building a future which could see multiracial and multi-ethnic democracies. In the 1950s also saw the emergence of a new generation of young Kenyan Indian lawyers. This is partly because the Second World War had made the access to legal education ironically cheaper. You could do many of your courses without traveling to London and only spend about a year there to sort of finish your exams. And there was a large pool of young men and a few women who had entered the legal profession, but did not have access to the kind of work that their seniors or the other European lawyers did. Initially, when the Mama emergency began, there was an unofficial European boycott of defending those accused of Mama violence. And some of these Indian lawyers began taking up these cases as proper defenses. But very soon, coordinated by the Indian High Commission and figures like Ashru Kapila, there became a kind of team of young Indian African lawyers who became to be engaged in defense of the Mama cases. Kapila himself represented over 300 different groups of accused of violence and got several of them off. The most spectacular one, of course, was the trial of the Kapangoria 6, which charged Jomo Kenyatta and a number of other political leaders for inciting and leading the Mau Mau.
What started as a haphazard, passion-driven defense effort soon became an orchestrated campaign between the Indian High Commission, lawyers like Ashru Kapila, and leaders of the Kikuyu political parties, who coordinated a team of defense lawyers who spread out across the terrain of Kenya during the emergency. An exasperated police officer would complain that no sooner had they arrested a Mau Mau suspect and Indian lawyers already appearing at the cell door ready to defend them. These legal trials were not just about theatrics and performance, but these lawyers played an important role in helping families, raising funds, organizing prison visits, organizing letter writing campaigns. Kenyan political leaders used these contacts, traveled to India to raise money for some of these defenses. And All India Radio's Swahili service became an important source of propaganda and news at this point of time. This, therefore, was not just about the act of lawyering in court, but was also an opportunity to build multiracial alliances in a deeply segregated society. As many people mention in their memoirs, the task of organizing a legal defense was one of the events that led to African political leaders entering the homes of Indians living in Kenya and forging alliances and friendships. At the end of the emergency and with Kenyan independence, there was a hope that this would lay the foundation of a certain kind of a multi-ethnic cooperation. But as I discuss in my paper, this situation became complicated over the next few years. And all four of the lawyers that I discuss in the paper at various points of time were either exiled, displaced, or migrated from Kenya and sort of carried their tactics and practices to the other sites that they went to. India in the case of Kapila Hingorani, the United Kingdom in the case of Mandla, and a sort of large tour around the world in the case of Yashpal Khai. So what can legal lives, partial and performative,
Tell us about minority rights and practices of claim making. Given that lawyering is fundamentally an act of representing another party, how does the lawyer's own identity affect the forms of claim making? So the body of scholarship on colonial lawyers has really argued that we have to understand lawyers as mediators or native elites who act as interpreters between the colonial state and society. There's also another body of work on minority lawyering, focusing on, say, African-American lawyers in the United States, the first women lawyers or Dalit lawyers in India, that have looked at how the professional act of lawyering creates a space of formal equality in unequal societies, allowing minority lawyers space and language to make claims for their communities. Both veins of scholarship underline how forms of professional citizenship mediate access to public spaces and how legal knowledge allows the use of new vocabularies of claim making. Insightful as this is, these models only partially explain the positionality of mid-20th century Indian African lawyers. Indian Africans were both a numerical minority in the spaces that resided and the middle of a racially and economically stratified colonial society. It is only in the legal profession where Indians achieved not just equality, but by the 1950s, dominance. Unlike, say, African lawyers in West Africa or Indian lawyers in India, Indian Africans struggled to translate legal representation of native Africans into a claim that they could speak for the African public. The bulk of East African Indians were engaged either in petty trade or low-level bureaucracy, which produced everyday tension and resentment of the African population. In contrast to the situations in, say, Fiji and Guyana, the Indian diaspora in East Africa did not have the numbers to position an electoral challenge, nor was there enough of a laboring population to create class-based solidarities. And the post-colonial state, while encouraging its diasporic members to work with African nationalists, did not actively advocate for their rights in East Africa. The most obvious parallel to the Indian African legal diaspora is the European Jewish diaspora. Certain parallels are striking. Both are groups that are prevented from purchasing or owning agricultural land and are limited to certain forms of petty commerce and money lending. Both groups are largely urban and heavily residentially segregated from the majority population. When segregation ends, they are able to enter into professions, and large numbers of young lawyers in each group are attracted to radical left and anti-colonial politics in the mid-20th century. James Loeffler, in his recent work, argues that Jewish internationalists in the interwar period invested in the international human rights regime as a method to protect the right of Jewish minorities. Jewish intellectuals lacked a state to speak for themselves on the international stage and therefore turned to international institutions. In contrast, the Indian state exists as an actor in a sort of formal sense right from the end of the First World War, even though it's not always representative of Indian interests. These two traditions of Jewish and Indian African diasporic lawyering are intertwined in unusual sites. For example, one such figure is Henry Pollack, a British Jewish lawyer who was Gandhi's law firm partner in South Africa. In the 1920s, Pollack moved to London, where he's secretary of the Association for Overseas Indians, and in that role lobbied for the rights of Indians across the British Empire and litigated cases for Indian rights before the Privy Council. Pollack and Gandhi grow apart over Gandhi's opposition to Indian involvement in the Second World War, but he returns to the scene in the 1950s, working alongside Ashoka Pillai in the Kapin Guria appeals in London. What do the peripatetic movements of Indian African lawyers tell us? For one, they help us overcome the problem of scale and find a history that is Indian or shaped by Indian experiences that exist in a number of different sites. Secondly, it shows us that the Indian African legal diaspora generates ideas, practices, and forms alliances that shape the ideologies and legal infrastructure across the globe.